Imagine you saw the emotion, you heard the emotion in Anthony Housefather as he gave those remarks. He sat down, and then everyone around him pretty much voted against him. Voted against him. And I mean that. They voted against him as a Jew. They voted against him as a member of the Liberal Party with a conscience on the question of Israel and what the Jewish community in this nation is facing. And I wanted to share another clip of him in the House of Commons foyer, in which he seems to be very well aware of what happened after he sat down and MPs voted.
Is this the first time that you're actually kind of reflecting on your role within this party? I mean, this has been going on for a number of months now. There's been tensions in Canada, rising anti-Semitism. You've seen your government struggle to sometimes or come up with a position that satisfies everybody, and you've kind of been at the forefront of this. But is this the first time you're actually kind of reflecting on your future here?
I think it's the first time in my parliamentary career that I've had a reflection like this, where I truly felt last night that a line had been crossed. When my party members got up and cheered and gave a standing ovation to Heather McPherson and the NDP, I started reflecting as to whether or not I belonged. And I will let you know further how I feel over the coming days. For the moment, I'm still there.
That was a very strong language from someone who's typically been a team player with his party. Joining me on the line now is Robert Walker, who's the Assistant Director for Honest Reporting Canada. Robert, good to have you on the show here. I mean, we heard that speech from Anthony Housefather in which he takes aim at what is one of the most, I'd say, dishonest portrayals we see, that you could separate Zionism from Judaism. And this is what we see in a lot of the media coverage, what we see in a lot of the protests. I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for the question and for covering this, because I think this is an angle that this term, this concept, has been completely abused and bastardized by the far left and those who seek to demonize Israel and the Jewish people writ large, which is, we talk about this indigenous movement, is that Zionism is the indigenous movement of the Jewish people, that this return to their ancestral homeland where they have lived for 3 millennia, practicing the same faith, speaking the same language, walking in the same steps. But if you listen, of course, to ideological extremists today in Canada and indeed around the world, they are this colonialist people who have invaded and kicked out the locals. And it's not just an inversion of reality, it is a moral outrage.
And I mean, one of the things that I think is so difficult here is that you have this language of colonial resistance that's being appropriated and applied to what's happened in the Middle East. And parties like the NDP will wear their keffiyehs in the House of Commons as they are voting on this. And they pretend this is benign.
Well, it certainly isn't, because I think what we've seen is not just the legitimization, if you will, of Hamas terrorism, and then that was a point pointed out by a number of parliamentarians who said that although the initial extreme motion as proposed by the NDP was a unilateral, calling for the government to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state, which of course anybody with a pair of eyes can look and say, listen, if October 7th hadn't happened, if Hamas's October 7th attacks hadn't happened, then very clearly that wouldn't have happened. So it's very clearly a reward for terrorism. And if you're sitting there and you're a Hamas leader, whether sitting on atop of billions of dollars in Qatar, whether you're sitting underneath the tunnels of Gaza, you're sitting there thinking, my goodness, the more terrorism that we perpetrate, the more legitimacy we get. The more legitimacy we get and the more credibility we get from certain individuals in Canada. And perhaps worst yet, was that this wasn't just, voted on by the NDP, but of course by the governing party of this country, the Liberal Party. And I think that sends a very, very powerful message, not just to Hamas, but indeed to Jewish Canadians and indeed to the majority of moral Canadians who look and say, you're allowed to have, this is a free country and we have a diversity of opinion and you're allowed to believe one thing or another. But this legitimizes not just Hamas terrorism, but indeed the scourge and rise of anti-Jewish hate here, which is, of course, not just a threat to Jewish Canadians, but to any Canadians who values the peace and security and order that we've come to value in this country. And when we have a government and when we have parliamentarians who vote in favor of a motion which glorifies and which excuses Hamas terrorism, that sets an extraordinarily dangerous precedent.
Well, and for people that are not as people that don't spend their lives immersed in this issue and pour over all the coverage, like certainly you do with your work and me to some extent, although I'd probably say not as much as you do, they are easily duped by no fault of their own by certain language. And a ceasefire, I think, is a great example of this, because a ceasefire, if you're just someone that doesn't like that war is taking place, this sounds like a very virtuous thing. Why is that not the case?
Well, everybody wants, in theory, a ceasefire at one point. The question is, under what conditions? Hamas wants a ceasefire once the Jews are dead. Israel wants a ceasefire, of course, once Hamas is defeated and the hostages are returned. So everybody's talking about a ceasefire, but the major issue that we see among the extremists who talk about a ceasefire, is very rarely that really there's a lot of context here, which is, of course, we want a ceasefire, but a ceasefire that keeps Hamas in power is ultimately nothing less than a capitulation. I shudder to think of what this dialogue would look like 80 years ago during World War II. People were talking about facing this scourge of the Nazi Germany and saying, well, ceasefire, ceasefire. Ultimately, I think if anybody who looks at, the Hamas casualty numbers, and this was pointed out last week, by a statistician at the Wharton School, who said that Hamas's numbers are essentially statistically impossible, that Hamas's numbers are fake, that Israel takes steps unprecedented in modern history to minimize civilian casualties, and ultimately, most importantly, this war could be over in 5 minutes if Hamas surrenders the hostages and surrenders its leaders. And until we have parliamentarians and protesters who refuse to call for that, I think it's very clear that anything short of that is ultimately a capitulation, not just of Israel, but every value that we as Canadians hold dear. And I think that what we've seen from the demonstrations, whether they're blocking hospitals, attacking synagogues, blocking roads, preventing G7 leaders from speaking, is that we can have a small minority of people, and as long as they're loud, they can have a bigger impact than 10 million people who are quiet. And I think this is perhaps the most chilling thing, is that 100 loud people can have a greater voice than 10 million quiet people. And this should be really the message for all of us, is to say, I read on Twitter and X and the comments, and people are angry and they're upset, and they're saying, listen, even if we don't all have the same view here, how dare you try to, you see the polls showing the Liberals 15, 20 points ahead. People are upset, people are angry, but rather than identifying and addressing the issues that are of concern to Canadians, we have this kind of politics of division. And people can be upset, but ultimately, unless we speak out and we demand better from elected officials, from the news media, who then give flattering coverage to this kind of content, ultimately we're going to see more of the same. The silent majority at some point needs to become the vocal majority. Otherwise, it really doesn't matter what the majority thinks.
I'd be remiss to not ask you as well, Robert, about this La Presse cartoon this morning that was published. I don't even want to put the image up, but it depicted, look, editorial cartoons are never flattering. We know that, but this depicted Netanyahu as a blood-sucking vampire, which is itself an old anti-Semitic trope here. And I believe they've pulled the cartoon, but only sort of in the face of backlash here. But my goodness, you'd never see this level of stereotype in a cartoon on any other group in Canadian media.
No, and nor should you. This cartoon, of course, borrowed from the 1922 silent German film, which extremely anti-Semitic, certainly in commentators today, depicted Jews as, first of all, as a stereotypical, hook-nosed Jew, depicted Jews as being carriers of disease, as bloodsuckers of virtuous young Christian children. And of course, this was imagery that was gladly and enthusiastically then mimicked and taken by the Nazis. So it's not only that we had this columnist decide to use this imagery, then he uses it to depict perhaps the most famous or the most prominent Jew in the world, the prime minister of the world's only Jewish state. That's crazy enough. But then at what point did the leadership of La Presse, a prominent French language newspaper, see no problem with this whatsoever. So at best case scenario, we have here profound ignorance, which honestly beggars belief is how these people were in journalism at all. That's one. And that's best case scenario. Worst case scenario was the embrace of vocal Nazi-like, right, caricature of Jews. I mean, it's obscene here, and it's akin to sort of describing, any other group with the kind of cartoons that we would expect, would remain in the dustbin of history. And so it's great that they've removed it, but honestly, it's like whack-a-mole here. And I think the more that we see the legitimization of anti-Semitism, or really the excusal of it when politicians stay quiet, news media organizations stay quiet, it becomes normalized, it becomes excused, and it becomes really normalized because those who seek to propagate this kind of stuff become emboldened, whether it's putting out anti-Semitic cartoons, whether it's blocking roads, synagogues, highway overpasses, or whether it's passing legislation or motions in the House of Commons, which are a one-sided defamation of a democratic country, all while downplaying really a genocidal Islamic terrorist organization. So I think that we as a society, we hear from our Prime Minister that this isn't who Canadians are, but ultimately we're seeing that that's exactly what Canadians are and what Canada is. And I think that it's high time. 5 months ago was high time, but now that the silent majority speak out and really say absolutely no more. This absolutely cannot continue a day longer.
Very well said. Robert Walker, Associate Director of Honest Reporting Canada. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.